Without much further ado, I am delighted to introduce Pete, who is going to be talking about the reasonably recent now, new vascular plant list for Great Britain, which was published at the end of 2025. Over to you, Pete.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks all, whoever you are out there, for joining us. Um, I'm going to set my stopwatch so that because for those of you that have been at one of my talks before, I do tend to ramble a bit. So welcome along to a chat about the new vascular plant red list for Great Britain. I'm Pete Stroh and I will get started. There's a lovely photo of grass of Parnassus there, which hopefully you've been admiring as you've been waiting. It's the obvious first question. What is a red list? So in modern terms, um, a red list is an assessment of extinction risk. And it uses standardized criteria which have been developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, over decades now. And it relates to aspects of population change and range expansion or contraction, so whether something's declining, increasing, or stable. Extinction's a fairly loaded term, and if you've seen some of the threatened species on the list, you might wonder how they'll ever go extinct. Um, I might wonder the same thing. I was often told to think about the passenger pigeon, but in any event, I'd like to think of a red listing exercise as more of a health check on our wild flora, which we really should do at least once every 10 years, but obviously resources permitting, and that's not viable with us. So we are where we are, and 20 years on from the last one, here's a third. The process of assessment is extremely rigorous, and as well as a group that was organized to go through all the results of the data, we're overseen by an independent IUCN assessor to make sure that we follow all the rules. And this red listing criteria, it's designed for use at a global level and also a regional level. So Great Britain would be, I think, considered a region. When you get down to England, Wales, and Scotland, in some respects, they qualify as regions too. But below that, this red listing exercise really isn't for use. I want to go back about 50 years to begin with to the first red list, which was actually called Red Data Book back then. It was published in 1977 by Frank Perring and Lynn Farrell, who, well, lots of you will know Lynn. Some of you may have met Franklin in the past. And that came about after the publication of the first atlas, which Franklin was a co-author on. But they saw that species were still in decline, especially rare species, and they wanted to have some kind of standardized criteria in place so that people could do something about it. So they updated the information that was collected for the first atlas and then published the first edition, which focused on nationally rare species. Those are the ones present in 15 10 kilometer squares, hectares or fewer. So in total, there are actually 321 species in the book. Some turned out to be in more than 15 hectares after they'd done their research. And then they published the second edition. So popular, they published the second edition in 1982. But it's important to note that both of these are before the IUCN criteria came into place. But these red data books were some of the first of their kind for plants, and they kick-started quite a few more, including these ones here. So there's one for stoneworts in 92 and lichens in 96. And also it was sort of halcyon days in a way for books on the British flora. And this book published by BSBI, JNCC and Institute for Terrestrial Ecology, which is now CEH, UK CEH, is a wonderful book. And that focused on nationally scarce plants in Britain. So that's 100 hectares or fewer. Um, and it's still completely relevant, unfortunately, in many respects, and well worth a read if you can still find a copy. So the third edition of what was still called a Red Data book was published in 1999, and it was compiled and edited by Martin Wigington, although I must say that Lynn Farrell had a huge input into this book too. It's a shame she wasn't acknowledged, but there you go. Um, it was considerably more detailed than the first two editions. The first two editions, interesting though they were, they didn't have a huge amount of detail on each species, and this one has at least a page of A4 on each of the species that included in the book. It's quite a chunky volume. Again, well worth looking at if you have the time, if only for the photo of Killarney fern on the front cover. Oh, sorry, not photo, but illustration of Killarney fern. And this was the first GB book that Red Data book that used IUCN criteria. They were sort of recently developed in I think it was 1989 they were developed. So Martin included taxa that were threatened, critically endangered, vulnerable, or near threatened. He also included nationally rare and scarce species which weren't assessed as threatened. And there's a huge amount of information on their ecology, distribution, both in here and Europe, and some of the reasons why they might be declining, and also some of the management that could be in place to help them improve. There is, I went through it today. There's no mention anywhere of the analysis used to determine the trends. So happy days back then. You could it was I wouldn't say it was subjective. I mean, it was based on the evidence, I'm sure, but wasn't quite as rigorous as these days. Um, so then we come to the Red Data List, not book, published in 2005, just after the second atlas was published. So this allowed the authors to use data collected for the first and the second atlas periods. And for the first time, in a red data list in this country, they included all natives and archaeophytes. And just in case you don't know what an archaeophyte is, it's a species which was introduced intentionally or unintentionally into these isles before 1500 AD. And yeah, it was based upon updated IUCN criteria from when Martin Wigington did his. And in order to assess trends over time, they used something called the Change Index, which was developed by Mark Telfer for the second atlas, which was a very sophisticated model for its time. Okay, so here we are. So well, no, not about 20 years later, we come to the new GB Red List. And again, we followed the IUCN guidance and criteria to the letter. Again, it has been updated since 2005, and there's a few changes in that. And we were lucky enough to have a third atlas data set to work with. So joyously, we now have 3 data points. And that's based on the third atlas, as many of you know, is based on the work by, I assume, all of you watching this, and about 10,000 more people. And over 30 million records were collected during that time. So it's a huge amount more data. So it became apparent very quickly that the 2005 Red List, which is based on 20th century data, was woefully out of date and needed updating. So the Species Status Assessment Group, which is made up of the statutory agencies of Wales, Scotland, and England, and also other interested parties. I better check this. I don't want to miss anyone out. So there was Plant Life, the British Terrological Society, Botanic Gardens of Kew and Edinburgh, and the Natural History Museum, and also other expert botanists such as David Pearman, Fred Rumsey, Simon Leach, Andy Jones, Richard Bateman, Richard Lansdowne. You can see the authorship if you look at the list anyway. The important thing, one of the crucial things, was the partnership that we've had with CEH over the years. BRC, CEH have worked on many different things over the year, and the BSBI have been involved too. It was really kick-started in earnest with David Pearman and Chris Preston, and now Ollie Pescott, who did all the analysis for us, and we couldn't have done this list without him. Um, so he used even more sophisticated analysis than Mark Telfer's, and the results are all, well, lots of the results are based on that. It's important to mention that all this has been very generously funded by Natural England, thanks really to Mags Cousins, who, if you don't know, is the senior vascular plant specialist at Natural England and also VCR in Shropshire, now my home county. Um, I was, I don't think I was chosen to lead the process. Maybe it's by default, but anyway, um, it was a hugely collaborative process. And then, of course, we had this independent assessor, Andrew Brown, who was extremely thorough and incredibly helpful. Oh, you'll see lots of nice photos throughout, in case I do waffle on too much. Um, so I put the name in, the scientific name and the common name below the photo, and you'll see that the scientific name's in a colour. So there's Trollius glowflowers in yellow. So yellow is equates to vulnerable. So each photograph, the colour equates to the threat status. So yellow's vulnerable, endangered's orange, critically endangered's red, and I don't think we've got any near threatened. Least concern is green. Very strange not seeing anyone coming out from the audience. Anyway, I'm sure you're all there. So the assessment process. I'll just briefly run through this. It took 2.5 years, so I'll give it 30 seconds or so. So after the data, so we have the atlas data, but for species that were in less than 30 hectads, we often needed updated population counts in the main. And also sometimes we had to count the number of locations a species is found within. And that was actually great fun. So, for example, I went to the lovely Market Western Fen to look at early marsh orchid, this variety of early marsh orchid. And then Ollie analysed the data, and then we started interrogating the results and fitting them with the IUCN criteria, which I'll show you very briefly in a minute. And then it was a question of sense checking the results and the fit to the IUCN criteria, because unfortunately isn't quite as straightforward as just ticking boxes. And then once we'd done that exercise, we passed it on to the assessor who had a look at it, and he came back with comments, a lot of comments at the beginning. And then we repeated steps 3 to 6 until it was finished. So yeah, that all took about 2.5 years. I'm not going to go through this, but this is the sort of condensed version of the IUCN criteria that we used. And I just wanted to highlight, so criterion A, population reduction, which is basically the trends and distribution. I highlighted the crucial bit. So you have to base your assessment, if you're using criterion A, on a trend within the past 10 years or 3 generations. Okay. So there are many challenging aspects to implementing the IUCN criteria for plants, really, in essence, because they were written for mammals. I believe the rumor is it was originally for African wild dogs, although I'm not sure if I can verify that. But anyway, plants and mammals are quite different in many respects. And so when it states and it stipulates quite strongly that and our IUCN assessor agreed that we did have to base our trends within 10 years or 3 generations, there were two main sticking points to that. The first is that our understanding, our knowledge of what the lifespan or generation of one individual of one species is not well known, to put it mildly. It's incredibly difficult to quantify for many plant species. Maybe not so much for the two species in the top right. They're both annuals, um, very nice annuals, but they do have relatively long-lived seed banks, which comes into the equation to some respect. The second really major problem was that we don't collect plant data in a way that is compatible with basing a trend on 10 years or three generations, whichever is the longest. I should have said that, sorry, whichever is the longest. Um, there are ways of extrapolating the model to fit those time periods, but it produces results which aren't fit to publish. Um, so the first thing I did was, we did, although it was a literature search to find out what information was out there on all native and archaeophyte species in Britain. Um, and we also compiled traits from various trait bases. And then we worked out a compromise with our assessor so that we would use a short-term trend for those species which had a relatively short lifespan based on traits or a literature search. And we'd use a long-term trend for those that had, we thought, quite a relatively long lifespan, such as the species in the bottom right there, Charaxolasia carpa, which is a long-lived rhizomatous perennial. So you'd imagine lives there for a long time. Although if you wanted to go about counting an individual of Charaxolasia carpa in that particular place, good luck to you. Anyway, at the end of it, end of this exercise, which did take quite a long time, there were a few more long-term trend than short-term trend, but it was almost 50-50. I should add that the same problem came up for the 2005 Red List authors, but A, they didn't have an independent IUCN assessor, and B, they only had two data points to work with. So really, it was a question of just first against second atlas back then. Okay, so I want to give two examples of how that comes into play. Um, the first is field gentian, Gentianella campestris. This is an annual, mostly herb with a known short-lived seed bank. It was assessed as vulnerable in 2005 because of a decline in distribution of more than 30%. However, our new assessment, based on the fact it's an annual with a short-lived seed bank, meant that we could not include the decline that had happened before 1987, which was the start of recording for the second atlas. So we're effectively working with a diminished distribution, and it could only be based on the short-term trend. So although we found a decline of 22% from the second to the third atlas, that figure didn't qualify as threatened or near threatened on any criteria, nor did the number of individuals. So although we don't know the number of individuals, we can give a rough estimate based on the Threatened Plants project, which the BSBI ran earlier on this century, and field gentian was one of the species included. We can certainly do it on the number of locations and the geographic range. So unfortunately, even though I think we're probably all aware it's a species of conservation concern, which is largely now confined to protected refugia, we couldn't, there was no way of making it threatened using the IUCN criteria. Neither is it nationally rare or near threatened. So I think this is an example where when you're thinking about conservation priorities, you just don't base it on one thing. You don't base it on a red list only, and you don't base it on whether it's nationally rare or nationally scarce. Sometimes you look at local rarity. Sometimes you just simply look at whether it's I think, whether it's an excellent indicator of species-rich habitat. I could go on. But the second example is sort of contrary to that. the lovely Carex lomosa, one of my favourite plants in British Isles, bog sedge. It's a rhizomatous perennial. It's probably very long-lived. It was assessed as least concern in 2005, which was certainly a surprise to me. Um, but we were able to use the long-term trend for this new red list, and we did find a decline of more than 30% in its extent of occupancy. So its geographic range had shrunk by 30%. With the majority of decline, lots of you will not be surprised to learn in lowland England, it still has its Scottish strongholds, and that photo is taken at one of them. Um, and we know why it's declined. It's the usual habitat destruction, and something that likes its feet very, very wet, drainage, probably got something to do with soil chemistry and structure as well, afforestation, etc. So why was it least concern in 2005 and it's flipped into vulnerable? I have a couple of theories about this. I think the first one is possibly the sensitivity of the model. And if it had been used, if the same model we use was used in 2005, they might have got the same result. Um, the, the second possible cause is that you had all this because the major decline, the major habitat destruction drainage took place between the 40s, 50s to about the end of the 1980s, really. Um, so that probably, as well as wiping out quite a few populations, it probably led to the diminishing of lots of populations which remained extant. And so they sort of hung on in there. So when the 2005 analysis was done, although they'd shrunk at a sort of local level, at a 10 kilometre square level, they were still present, even if it was just a few plants, it would still come into the occupied category. And then over the last, over the 20 years since then, lots of those populations have gone. They just couldn't hang on any longer. And so it's flipped it's flipped into decline. I should really look more into that. Um, so here are headline results. I don't know why I'm smiling. It doesn't make particularly good reading. So about 25% of our wild flora, native and archaeophytes, um, are assessed as threatened. That's critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. A lot more are near threatened. And also that excludes some of the large critical groups which um, were assessed for this red list are in the appendices when you look at it. And they were done for the first time in Britain, possibly globally. Um, and that's thanks to experts in their fields, including Tim Rich, Simon Leach, Julian Woodman, John Richards, Fred Rumsey. Probably left someone out, to which I apologise. And the drivers for such decline are, I'm afraid, the usual tale. We keep on saying it. So it ranges from all those things you can see there: pollution, eutrophication, different grazing pressures, development, increased fragmentation has a huge amount to do with it, I think, as does obviously the widespread intensification of land management that's been happening for a long, long time now. And more so with this red list than any other, I think, climate change. Well, definitely, actually. I think we can probably link something like alpine gentian, which you can see on the screen there. At least one of the effects of its decline is linked to climate change. It's very hard to sort of separate all the different factors, but we're fairly sure that climate change is one of the factors that's led to its decline. And it's almost at the limit. It's the photo I took there is on Ben Lawes, and it really can't go any further up there. And worst hit, although all habitats are fairly badly hit, grasslands, wetlands, and heathlands in lowland areas were really, I mean, they were trashed. Um, there's a bit of good news. 111 taxa had a reduced threat level compared with 2005. Which is good news, and obviously lots of work has been done this century to try and you know, make inroads into recovery for lots of our rarest and scarcer species. But I'm afraid that that reduced threat levels in many cases because we use the short rather than the long-term trend, I think. So we're looking at a sort of diminished distribution to start with. Um, People at the IUCN would disagree because, of course, you have to have a cutoff somewhere, and that does make sense. But we're very familiar with looking at trends from a perspective of the first atlas, I think. 283 taxa had an increased threat level. Um, Many of these are what we might term positive indicator species. So the ones that you'd be happy to find, and they might indicate nice semi-improved habitats. And many of these were previously least concern, and they've gone into vulnerable now. And as I mentioned, for a suite of Arctic alpine species, the threat was linked to the symptoms of climate change. So I'm just gonna, I think, yeah. So I just wanted to focus for a second on a few of the positive indicators, which some of you, depending on where you live, might find a surprise um, in their threat status. So all of these are previously least concern. But I guess, I mean, people in lowland England, I don't think are going to be surprised about these species at all. And then if you think about when you go out botanizing, you go to a nice nature reserve that's in good condition, and depending on where you are, you might hope to find these things. Um, but in the wider countryside outside of protected reserves, I mean, how often do you come into contact with marsh lousewort or even breast harrow, really? Certainly not common milkwort, and herb Paris is almost entirely restricted to ancient woodland. Devil's bit scabious, it's and to a certain extent marsh marigold as well, are just a I think they're the sort of canary. I'm not sure. The canary's kind of flown now, so whatever comes after a canary um, in the coal mine of it's these are things which were wildly common and everywhere, and they would have been admired on a local dog walk 100 years ago around where I am probably, and now they're not there, and you really have to go to nice places to see them. And I'm now going to show you, I'm going to treat you to a few more. I'm going to use video on a PowerPoint, which is a new thing to me, so I'm old. So, oh, hopefully that's not too loud. Just sit back and relax, watch the Bettany. I think that's a large skipper. So all these videos were taken. These are all, by the way, vulnerable, as you'll see from the writing. Um, So Bethany is a species which would have been really not very widespread and has now retracted its range to the point where it's vulnerable. Oh, as has as has flaking grass, if you can hear me above the plane. That plane's actually dragging a glider. So once the plane goes, it's very peaceful up there. But Media again, certainly where I was in Northamptonshire, you wouldn't find it outside of the small sort of pocket-sized reserves. And the same with salad burnet, which, you know, I've this is one of the ones I was surprised about actually. But then you think it's a really nice indicator of semi-improved habitat, and we're losing our semi-improved habitat every year, either through habitat destruction, but more often through habitat neglect. Pepper saxifrage has never been wildly common, but it's something you'd like to find in a nice neutral hay meadow, perhaps. I was looking for it in Shropshire and I can't find it, and I think there was one site left and that's gone now. And that's the meadow, which I took all those videos in. It was my local meadow, and it's at the edge of a woodland. There's a triple SI woodland just to your right, which is quite extensive. And then if you look at an aerial photo, there's pockets of conifer plantations within the broadleaf woodland. And if you go back and look at an OS map from the late 19th century, you'll see that all those pockets of conifer plantations for once open grassland. So probably a lot like this. This is a designated a triple SI. It's incredibly herb rich. Hay meadow. It's very, very well managed. But that's the only surviving fragment, and there were about 70 others in this woodland 100 years ago. So that's where we're at. So these places are very, very important, as we all know. So how do we make use of this red list so that those kinds of places are kept intact and well managed and maybe are expanded and there's and to a certain extent recreated if we have enough patience and time. So I think there's a few sort of key messages to come out of the red list, and the use of standardized criteria, which is strictly enforced by the IUCN, does enable comparisons with other regions so we can see the bigger picture. And we do have quite a lot of species. One of the columns in the red list shows us which species we have internationally important populations of. Um, Other countries in Northern Europe might have those species as threatened, and we hold the majority of the population, so it makes it important in its own right. We hold a lot of species at their northerly global range and a fair few at their southern range too. So I think as well as seeing the bigger picture, it allows us to communicate more with um, other regions, other countries, and I think we should be doing more of that. Importantly, threat statuses are now used in the triple SI notification process. That's a fairly recent development. And they're often applied when prioritizing funding for species recovery work. So another very important use. And by association, the list highlights the habitats that are most under threat as well, so that we can think about which habitats to prioritize and which ones are most readily recreated, whether that's by tumble down next to the edges of extant woodland or whether that's by sowing seeds, whatever it is. And we, importantly, this provides evidence to government and it demonstrates really the urgent need to do something about this. With the if I sound a tiny bit jaded when I go through the reasons for decline, it's because I mean we really had enough evidence in the 1980s to do to know what was happening, um, and still we're talking about decline and still we're talking about the same reasons. So there really is an urgent need now to allocate funding appropriately. I've put that in italics on purpose, and also with expert advice too, to allocate that money to meet the targets that governments have signed up to deliver. Rant over. Um, so I think Sarah might have put a link in the chat somewhere, but just in case you don't know, um, the Red List was published in British and Irish Botany as a paper. So for those of you that aren't members and didn't get it, it's a free to download paper, and you can find that on the BSBI website. You don't, I mean, you can use that link, but I think if with our new All Singing All Dancing website, I think if you type in GB Red List, you'll find it there, and also an ebook um, of the paper, but with a different design to the paper because we got a professional designer to do a nice glossy publication with the tables included within the PDF, and that is available at a cost unless you are a vice counter recorder or a referee, in which case it's free to download. The new threat statuses are in the database, so they're freely available to use any search query at the moment. And we plan to update the Plant Atlas website. That has in the conservation tab the threat status, but that's currently the 2005 threat status for GB. So those will be updated when we get the opportunity to do so. I have rather rambled and raced through this talk, so I'll have plenty of time for questions. But thank you very much for listening and absolutely for your records.
Thank you, Pete. That was brilliant. We do have a couple of Q&As that have already come in, and then if anyone else wants to add any, please do. Oh, they're already coming in. Fantastic. The first one is one that might make you run away, though, I'm afraid. Jan has asked, are there any plans to update the England red list?
It's a good question. Um, well, what we are planning to do, or actually more accurately, what Fred Rumsey is planning to do at the moment, is to compile all the new threat statuses for the England only taxa. So those are the plants which are in Great Britain, but they only are found in England. So we can easily translate the threat status for those from GB to England because they only appear in England. Um, as for revising the entire England list, it is needed. Um, it does depend on, unfortunately, funding, as all these things do, and also the availability of the right person to undertake the exercise. But I know that Natural England are keen on exploring the opportunities. Um, and yeah, I guess it's just a question of, it's a horrible phrase, but watch this space.
Thank you. Heather has asked, is there a list which shows any changes in the threat status for individual species?
Yes. So in the list itself, it's basically a massive spreadsheet, and you can see you can see if it's yeah, you can see whether it's had an increased threat or a decreased threat. As you can filter it on one of the columns. See, and then in the notes next to it, I, as I remember, you can see what it used to be, what the threat status used to be. So you can do it that way. The other way of doing it is if you have access to the BSBI database, is you can do a search query because as well as having the updated red list statuses, you also have the 2005 red list statuses. So you can do a relatively simple search query that way too.
Brilliant. Richard Bateman has
Oh,
asked if you
oh
could
dear.
improve if you could improve just one IUNC excuse me IUCN criterion, which would you change and why?
Yes. Um, that's a good question, Richard. You've been thinking about this long and hard, and I have not. Well, I have, but I'm not so much thinking about changing as actually enacting the criteria which I have to use. Um, I I think I'd be more flexible about the time periods used to assess a species trend over time. I think I'd also probably like to change some of the thresholds for um, what's considered to be vulnerable. It, I was interested, no one else might be, but I was interested to see that in the 1999 edition of the Red Data Book, the vulnerable threshold was 20%. Um, and I gave a similar talk to this in Shropshire a while ago, and someone asked me afterwards why the threshold was 30%. That seems very high. Um, and I'm not sure when it changed from 20 to 30, but yes, 30 does seem quite high. I'm sure I could give a more erudite answer to your question, Richard, if I wasn't panicking slightly.
An interesting question here from Anne, who's asked, are pollination methods of species or the risk of plant diseases effects shown in the information?
That they are, well, you might say they are to a certain extent for some species, perhaps. It's very difficult to, well, the simple answer is no,
Hmm.
but then decline will be linked in part
Yes.
to
Yeah.
perhaps the spread of fungal diseases, or in the case of there have been studies done on a couple of orchid species, which people will know about, though done by Michael Hutchins and others, that showed as the climate was changing and pollinator emergence changed, there was a disconnect between the pollinator emerging and the flower opening for it to pollinate. And I'm sure that's happening for a few species, but I think there's too much noise to separate that out from the analysis that we're doing, which is at a 10 kilometer square scale.
It's the jumping off board for more for other people to go off and look at these trickier
Absolutely. Yeah,
aspects.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Dan's asked a similar question, which is that whether excessive mowing might be playing its own part in the intensification of land management, which I imagine would be the same sort of answer that anything that is impacting on habitats is going to be.
Yeah, it very much depends on where you are in terms of excess. I mean, depends on the definition of excessive. I mean, in some cases, I remember my mum's old lawn. I grew up in Torquay. We had a flat, and the grassland. We had a downstairs flat. You could go out into the lawn, the garden. Sorry, couldn't find the word garden. And it was mown twice a week, every week, no matter what. And in between mowing in the late summer, all the autumn ladies' tresses would come up, and you had I don't know, you had also it's a really species-rich lawn, and because it was mowed every 2 weeks, there wasn't enough clippings to sort of build up a thatch, and so it was this constant process. But yeah, I could go on. Excessive mowing can be damaging. Um, the more damaging factor is when you mow and leave clippings on and it builds up a thatch over time. That's a whole new talk, really.
Next year. This is, I guess, more of a kind of comment from Dave Lang, and he said, "While I absolutely respect the scientific rigor with which these assessments were made, bodies like the BSBI need to be careful with how they communicate these findings to non-scientists. A local biodiversity officer in West Central Scotland said to me on seeing the list something along the lines of, 'Oh, they've just stuck all the upland plant species on the list. It'll be hard for people in some parts of the countries to get their head around Calluna vulgaris,
No,
etc. And even Cystia pratensis, more worthy of concern than our species like Gentinella campestris as they see them every day.'"
yes. Well,
Mm.
I'd say two things to that. The first is that this is a red list for Great Britain. And unfortunately for the lovely uplands of Scotland, most of the declines happen in the lowlands of England, also Scotland and Wales.
Mm.
Um, and so, and I should also add that Calluna vulgaris heather is near threatened, which isn't an official IUCN category. I'd also suggest, I mean, I carefully suggest that the person that made that comment hadn't actually read the red list, the introduction. But really, it brings me back to the point of the first question about an updated England red list. That's been extremely useful for Natural England, I know. And there is currently no red list for Scotland. There never has been. And I think, I hope that after their recent publication, recent enactment, was it the Environment Act? I think they've just signed off. Hopefully, there'll be the money forthcoming to do a Scotland red list because I'm certain that that heather, for example, and probably even Devil's Bit scabious wouldn't be would be least concern in Scotland.
Another similar sort of comment here, but from Jonathan Shanklin, some newly threatened species perhaps send the wrong message, e.g. having Synapsis arvensis as a threatened species does potentially make many arable fields potential county wildlife sites in southern England.
Well, I'm afraid yes. I mean, we're
Mm.
we're basing our results on the evidence. So, I mean, it may be common in some places, but it
Mm.
has declined
Mm.
by a sufficient amount to merit threatened status. And at the beginning of this whole exercise, we had the results and we ran through them, and there's also a model-based certainty to these results as well. So it's got a sort of standardized error attached to them too. And we were going through them, and I was thinking, well, no, that's not vulnerable. That's least concern. I don't believe that. And everyone in the group did that. And we came back. Everyone had a different perspective because people live in different places. And it
Mm.
was a lesson that you have to go on the evidence, albeit you have to interpret, you can't blindly go into just saying, yes, I believe that trend. But there was no reason to doubt the trend for Synapis arvensis, for example, and so it is threatened.
I'm just going to do a shout out for our next talk, which is on shifting baseline syndrome, which might be an interesting sort of follow on to
Mm.
this that's happening in 2 weeks' time. Um, Jim says, you mentioned that field gentian was downgraded, but still important. How would you assess which are the important species at a site slash Vice County? Which other sources might you use, and how would you use these in conjunction?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think I'd straight away go for rare plant registers. Um, for those of you that don't know, these were the concept of a rare plant register. It's based on a vice county. So it's the data within a vice county. And it was started, I don't know, possibly over 20 years ago now. And many numerous vice counties now have a rare plant register. And these list not only the nationally scarce, nationally threatened, and nationally scarce, nationally threatened, nationally rare, but locally rare, locally scarce, locally threatened. So they're a really, really good source of information to go to in the first instance.
I've just popped a link to the BSBI list of rare plant registers in the chat as well, if anyone's looking for those. Rachel says, you mentioned specific habitats, e.g. wetlands, where a great number of species have had a change in status and become vulnerable. Are there more details about this analysis?
Yes. Well, are there? Are there? Hold on, let me think. Well, I don't think we've done a broad habitat analysis within the paper. There are examples of species within each broad habitat within the paper. Um, so that's one way of finding it. If you really, really wanted to dig down, then again, it's a question of use. You can use a database search which has the red list of species, and then you can also use um, the Ellenberg values, which are in the database as well. So you could base Ellenberg values for moisture. So you could have, I don't know, what would it be? Something like 7 or 8 Ellenberg up until 12. It goes up to 12 for moisture. And then look at them that way around, perhaps. But certainly there's examples in the paper.
Hmm. Iris asked, was there any plant on the 2025 red list that really surprised you to see classified as threatened?
Uh, yeah, quite a few. Yeah, quite a few. I mean, Jonathan does raise a. I mean, Sinapis arvensis Charlotte. I was shocked that that was on the list. But it's an easy species to identify. Well, relatively easy species to identify. So yeah, I was pretty surprised about that one. I wasn't so surprised about something like um, well, Heather was near threatened, but I wasn't surprised about that. It's actually near threatened in England, and that was published in 2014. And so if you think that most of the decline, the huge bulk of decline happened in England, that's not really surprising. I'm sure I could think of others if I'm afraid quite a jaded botanist, so nothing much surprises me.
We end up pointing you towards all the losses every time, Pete.
Yes, yes.
Those sorts of things, yes. Um, Perhaps we might finish on this one from Jan, which is an interesting question. I wouldn't say this on many things, but I think potentially maybe I can speak to this more than you can, Pete. But she says, does BSBI have any idea, brackets evidence, how many of the general public have even heard of any of these species which are now
Mm,
threatened, let alone knowing what they look like,
yeah,
might therefore care more about the possibility of losing them from the countryside?
yeah,
You can give your
yeah.
thoughts. Yeah.
I think that's a yeah. You've hit the nail on the head. That's what I would say. Yeah, I mean, in part, that's why I think that when I wasn't really involved in the press release, I thought it's very well done, but it used those relatively common species because people will connect with those. But I agree that um, there's a lot to be done to reconnect people with the nature and wildflowers on their doorstep. And it's not an insurmountable task, I don't think. There's a huge amount of activity which goes on in each different vice county. Um, and, you know, it only takes a few people in each of their neighborhoods, their local areas, to get involved and try and get groups together. And all of a sudden you build up momentum. And I don't think it's a lost cause. I don't think that many people know a daisy from a buttercup, but that doesn't mean it can't change.
I would just say to your question, Jan, I wouldn't say we have great evidence about where we sort of stand as a society with our plant knowledge. We know it's decreased as with it's kind of, I guess it's on the threatened end of the scale now, but we are seeing more and more people coming to our different activities, which is fantastic. We've just started one called the 100 Plants Challenge for this year, which is about getting beginners to try and see 100 different plant species and understand that they could recognize 100 different plant species this year. So huge amount of work going on at the kind of introductory end of the scale, but also, as Pete said, there's the number of experts, the number of people leading field meetings, and trying to pass on that necessity of protecting wild plants to a new generation is really encouraging to see as well. So part
Yeah,
of that is doing what we're just doing here tonight too.
yeah, yeah. And I would say, sorry, but I agree, Sarah. I'd also say I think we underestimate how many people are out there looking
Mm.
and are just looking, you know, for the pleasure of it all and aren't involved in society, so we don't know about them. I've heard for the past 25 years that the dearth, that the worry that there'll never be any young up and coming field botanists ever again, and they always appear out of the woodwork sooner or later.
Mm.
People are out there. People are, especially after 2020, but people are really they got to know their local neighborhoods sometimes really intimately, and I think it's just a question of, you know, trying to tease them out of the woodwork a little bit, and you know, everyone's vote counts, and I think the only way that we're going to ever hope to get any change is by politicians listening, and the more people that vote about these issues, the better. So yeah, BSBI is doing a great job.
I think that's a really great note to end on. So thank you again, Pete, and thank you for everyone who has come along this evening. As I said, the video for this one will be going up on YouTube. And if you're interested in any of the other winter talks we've got coming up, we've got 3 more left for this year, but we've also got recordings of all the ones that have taken place previously. Take a look at the website or Google BSBI Winter Talks. But thank you all again for coming. Thank you. Bye.